Imagine you're in a discussion with a peer. Maybe it's a philosophical or a religious or a political one. And they have some opinion or position that they hold, and their justification is that, well, it's just common sense. In many cases, you might respond to this by thinking, well, that's not very good justification. This is just providing your opinion and telling me that I should follow your opinion just because it's your opinion. This is the traditional philosophical approach to common sense. That common sense is not a very good reason. In fact, it is opposed to reason, and thus it is opposed to truth, to reality. That this is the mere semblance of opinions and appearances that vacillate, but they don't get at what's really true. And this is a trend that has long held in philosophy, but at around the turn of the 20th century, or maybe starting in the 1890s, we can see philosophy taking a very different approach to common sense, to its value, to its relationship to truth and knowledge and reality. And in this lecture, I would like to build up these two contrasting approaches to common sense. The sort of ancient, classical, and modern approach to common sense, which is traditionally opposed to common sense. And then I'll be looking at the pragmatist / postmodern approach to common sense, where it may actually have a bit more value. Now, many of the classic philosophers were opposed to common sense for reasons that you might expect. In the case of you having your disagreement or your interaction with your friend, and they just give common sense as a reason, you might say, well, this is just an isolated little opinion unto itself. It's not reaching out and giving us true relations to other things. It's just you asserting an opinion. And this is the sort of castigation of opinion you might see in Plato, in the Republic, for example, when he gives the allegory or the simile of the cave, where you have a bunch of people in a cave and they are chained in such a way where they are facing a wall in which images, specifically shadows of things, are projected onto this wall. And there's a fire behind them which is projecting its light over various objects, which are then projected onto the wall of the cave. And the people who are chained can't turn their heads, but they see and hear things and they assume that this is what is true. And for Plato, this represents the sort of vacillation of images, of appearances, of the phenomena, of things that have been subjectively tainted by our perception. They are things that are filtered through our perception and therefore give us a very particular apprehension of the things. But they don't give us the things in themselves in the same way that the fire sending its light over the various objects and presenting images is giving you a representation, a representation of the thing which is actually being projected. And Plato imagines, okay, what happens if someone is released from their shackles and they turn around and they see all this projection going on. They see the fire and they see the sort of simulacra that they're in, and they see that there's a possible way out of the cave. And it's not easy going, but through the help of dialectic, which is to say a logical progression of facts guided by reason, they may eventually get out of the cave into the light of the true world. The sun will shine upon their eyes and initially blind them, but over the course of this adjustment period, they will grow acclimated to the truth of things as they really are. And Plato sees this as the ideal role of philosophy: to get beyond images, to get beyond opinions, because Plato says that, for example, knowledge is concerned with things that are, things as they really are. And for Plato, this isness of the real things is unitary. It is unmovable, eternal. It is the way things are that will never change. So for example, what the things really are, say a tree, beyond my apprehension of it through my senses, Plato would say, well, that thing doesn't actually change. Now, you think you see it changing because of all of the, sort of subjective marring that goes on by your perception. But if you really were able to get beyond perception, if you were able to deductively figure out what is really true about the things in themselves, the Dingen an sich, as Kant and other Germans put it, then you would see that being in and of itself is static, unitary, and one. And Plato says that this is what knowledge is concerned with, knowing things as they really are, whereas opinion does not know, but rather opines. It is concerned with the fleeting, the vain, the untrue. It's not necessarily false because you are opining something. It's just maybe as a grain of truth, but it is a fleeting truth, and it does not take up the majority of what the opinion is. And Plato is very wary of images. And one of the problems that really mars Plato's philosophy that is going to be expounded upon by other figures is Plato sees all knowledge as a representation. That we take what's out there and we represent it in our minds via images in our heads. And the problem is, how do you know things as they actually are if all your experience is controlled by images? All your concepts, all your ways of conceptualizing the world, Plato says, are formal objects of knowledge, basically. An opinion is usually just going to be something that rests on a sort of ambiguous common sense that's not actually going to be able to logically situate concepts in ways that allows us to recognize the idea or the form of the thing as such. A good example of the forms is, for example, I've got this book here of Aristotle's Politics, and this is one book among many books. We may call it a particular book, a particular. And the particulars are multiple. Here's one book, here's another book, there are plenty more books, and they all have many differences. Differences in size, in shape, in content, in the expression of that content to myself. But Plato would say that my ability to recognize this as a book and also recognize this as a book means that there must be some common form of bookness shared by the both of them that allows me to classify them under the same category. And this common form is the ideal, the forms with a capital F, or the idea for Plato. So there is an idea of bookness, some common essence shared by all books, which is the cause, for Plato, of the particular books. It causes them to be able to be recognized in a certain way and referred to, and allows for us to do things with. So for Plato, all action, all recognition, all differentiation is built upon the ideal. And for Plato, the ideal is what is really real. There's a sort of no true Scotsman going on there of, oh, these things that you think are real, they're not really real. They're just kind of real, but not really real. And Plato wants to get to the really real, what really is. Because Plato says, what's true will never change, right? What a book is, for Plato, he says, is not going to change. If it was changing, how could we have some sort of common essential reference that helps us understand what a book is? So for Plato, he's trying to get past semblances, past images, past representations of this or that book, and rather to the form of bookness as such, of what really is. And common sense and opinion are antithetical to this truth as Plato sees them. And this is the sort of common mentality we get to common sense. We have a differentiation between knowing that and knowing how. Knowing that is, for example, knowing that this is a book, knowing that it is orange and black and white, knowing that it is such and such a size. These are formal characterizations and qualifications of this particular thing, which is to say that it has some sort of logically consistent form. I'm able to express it. I'm able to conceptualize it. I'm able to put it into logical relation with, for example, other books and other formalizations. Whereas a non-formal thing, oftentimes common sense is an example of such a non-formal thing. If you asked me why I believe that, for example, when I turn a door handle and push the door, it's going to open, I don't have formal reasons for this at all. This is just a form of know-how that I know how to do. And I've gleaned it from my environment, not even from people explicitly having to teach it to me in a formal way, but I just know how to do things. And for Plato, and for a lot of medieval and modern philosophers, all the way up to Descartes, to Kant, true knowledge is formal, and thus truth is formal. It is something logical and reason-based, and something that we can put in the form of syllogisms and things like that. So know-how is not true knowledge. They would say, well, you don't actually know this. You just think you know this. And if I prompt you, okay, how do you open a door, or what happens when you open a door, then Plato would say, this is the impetus, this is the problematic that establishes you down the road of dialectic, of logically and reasonably going through various steps to arrive at the truth of the door, of my relation to the door, of the various virtues of doors, for example, which is something equivalent to their authentic function, for example. So know-how, in a similar way to common sense, for a lot of these ancient, medieval, and modern philosophers, is not going to be seen as true knowledge at all. It is something flimsy, something basic, something primal and ugly in a sense. And this is relating to a lot of what's going on in various religious philosophies, for example, that are privileging the soul or the sublime over the bodily, over the embodied things. Because know-how is something that we embody in our everyday experience. And Heidegger is someone who points this out and really gets us to question this. And he does this, for example, in his 1927 work Sein und Zeit, Being in Time, in which he really questions this privileging of formal knowledge, of subjectified knowledge, that all knowledge is primarily subjective and a representation. He's going against so much of what Plato and Descartes and Kant and Hegel and all these people are standing for when they're creating the sort of philosophical ponderings that I've been talking about. And Heidegger says, well, in fact, most of our knowledge in our everyday experience is not formal knowledge of any kind. It's the kind of knowledge of I can turn a door handle, push the door, go through the door, sit down in a chair, and I didn't know this formally at all. I knew it through my immersion in a social background, which acts as an environment from which I glean my knowledge, but which is practical knowledge, which is knowledge grounded in the everyday and grounded in the non-formal characteristics of the everyday world. The fact that when I open the door, I never knew it in a formal way. I couldn't have presented it to you as a syllogism until you maybe asked me how to, and then I give you a list of steps of this is how you open a door and such and such. So for Heidegger, know-how is not a deficient form of knowledge, but in fact is the primary form of knowledge. And our ability to logically abstract, to do true philosophy concerned with the ideal, Heidegger says, well, the ideal is not what is really real. In fact, the everyday and the non-formal, and indeed that which is common sense, is what is most real. It's what grounds us to the world, and in fact, it is the foundation upon which we build concepts such as the self, truth with a capital T, knowledge, permanence, the divine. All of this he sees as being built upon everyday experience, on worldliness, Weltlichkeit. And this is something that Heidegger is not the only one to reach. This was reached actually before Heidegger in the 1890s and around the turn of the 20th century with the American pragmatists, with people like Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. And John Dewey is the most similar to Heidegger, and I'd like to read a little passage for you which maybe is a little dense, but might get the point across of this recognition of the importance and in fact the primariness of non-formal knowledge, which is going to lead to a new respect for common sense. He says, "Let us make one effort more to clear up these points. Suppose it is a question of knowledge of water. The thing to be known does not present itself primarily as a matter of knowledge and ignorance at all. It occurs as a stimulus to action and as the source of certain undergoings. It is something to react to. In other words, it's something that matters to us. To drink, to wash with, to put out fire with, and also something that reacts unexpectedly to our reactions, that makes us undergo disease, suffocation, drowning. In other words, we are enamored with and immersed with the world, and it matters to us when something happens in this world. In this twofold way, water or anything else enters into experience. Such presence and experience has of itself nothing to do with knowledge or consciousness, nothing that is in the sense of depending upon them, though it has everything to do with knowledge and consciousness in the sense that the latter depends upon prior experience of this non-cognitive sort. In other words, this knowledge, which has nothing to do with my conceptualization of it insofar as my opening up the door didn't depend upon the prior condition, upon the necessary condition of me having a concept of it. In fact, it's the reverse. My having a concept of it is predicated on my having an embodied, non-formal experience of it, which serves as the foundation. Man's experience is what it is because his response to things, even successful response, and the reactions of things to his life are so radically different from knowledge. The difficulties and tragedies of life, the stimuli to acquire knowledge, lie in the radical disparity of presence in experience and presence in knowing. So Dewey's making a differentiation similar to knowing that and knowing how. Knowing that is presence in knowledge. It is something formal. It is a concept that you could, for example, put in the form of a logical syllogism. Whereas presence in experience is what Heidegger would call pre-ontological or existential. It has to do with the everyday tarrying with the world, and it shows up to us in the way in which it matters to us before we ever can classify it as an object, strictly speaking. And for Dewey, he understands that, for example, because of this change, an object possesses truth or error, which the physical occurrence as such never had. It is classifiable as fact or fantasy. It is of a sort or kind, expresses an essence or nature, possesses implications, etc. That is to say, it is marked by specifiable logical traits not found in physical occurrences as such. Because objective idealisms have seized upon these traits as constituting the very essence of reality with a capital R, is no reason for proclaiming that they are ready-made features of physical happenings, and hence for maintaining that knowing is nothing but an appearance of things on a stage for which consciousness supplies the footlights. For only the epistemological predicament leads to presentations being regarded as cognitions of things which were previously unpresented. What he's saying here is that this idealistic privileging of the ideal, of the rational, the likes of which we see in Plato, Descartes, Kant, that I've been discussing, where what is really real is not this particular book, but the form which is abstract and is in its own realm, and is what this particular book refers to and participates in to get its identity. Dewey and the pragmatists and Heidegger say no. The particulars are what are real. And they are fleeting, and they are changing, and our ideals, in fact, do change, because reality and truth is not something stable. For them, it is a process of constantly interacting existentially, spatially, and temporally in ways that evolve, that open themselves up for investigation, for meaning-making, for interaction. And what we're doing when we are concerned with things is not trying to abstract away, but in fact to learn how to tarry with those things in effective manners. All knowledge is, for these pragmatists, and maybe even for Heidegger, ultimately concerned with our tarrying with the world. It's concerned with our ability to construct ways of being. Because being, for Heidegger, for example, is a way of being. It is an action. As Heidegger says, we are what we do. Action is the very substance of being, and thus being itself is an active unfolding. And as such, common sense, and this is a roundabout way and a very complicated way to get back to common sense, has now taken on a totally different meaning. Because, for example, the common sense that informs my know-how of opening a door is in fact very important. And without common sense, we'd be dead in the water. We would have a few abstract truths like cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, the famous Cartesian knowledge claim. And sure, this may be true in the capital T sense, but it is in such an abstract way that, as William James says, there can be no difference which does not make a difference. That being a difference within practical experience. So he says that, for example, the differences between the Catholic and the Protestant understanding of the transubstantiation of the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Jesus Christ, whether or not this is real or just metaphorically real, as long as this is producing the same actions in the congregants, the same approaches to their lives, well, it doesn't really make a difference which one of these you choose. And in the same way, these postmodern, you might even say, philosophers, these are really some of the first postmodern philosophers, the people who are genuinely going beyond what the modernists had in mind with regards to truth, rationality, knowledge, identity, action. These are the people who are really going against modernism and can really be seen as the first postmodernists, and with it comes an understanding of the importance of embodied practical experience, the epitome of which is common sense, of the ability to know something without knowing it in the modern sense of knowing it in a rational, formal way. It is merely my ability to testify to the fact that I know the world in a deeper sense, that I am enamored with it, that I am caught up with it, and that it matters to me in a way that I cannot usefully interact with the world by abstracting from it, by being concerned with the ideal. That this is going to lead me to, for example, totalitarian and parasitic conceptions of the state, the likes of which we see in Plato's Republic. That this is not, in fact, going to provide me with truth, but it's going to provide me with cancerous approaches to the world. And thus this privileging of common sense, of the non-formal ways of knowing, is a profound switch that is occurring between the ancients, the medievals, and the moderns, and the pragmatists and postmodern people. So I hope that this might make you think a little bit differently about common sense. Not that common sense in and of itself is an explanation. If someone is in a political argument with you, I'm sure you've run into situations where they might say, well, this is just common sense, or this is the way that I grew up with things. And you might say, well, This is something that concerns me and other people. And your opinion in and of itself on its own is not necessarily the most beneficial explanation. Maybe we do need something more rational, more robust, more logical. These postmoderns are not doing away with logic or rationality as such, but rather they're reconceptualizing our approach to cognition, to consciousness, to truth, to experience, seeing this in a new way that is going to bring into the fore things like culture, things like the changing vicissitudes of our everyday life and the concerns and values and meanings that go along with them. I think this is a profoundly interesting and important change occurring in philosophy that anyone who wants to know something about contemporary philosophy should understand and be able to tarry with well, and thus be able to find some value in common sense that many of the ancient, medieval, and modern philosophers may not have considered. So that being said, I hope that this is interesting and somewhat helpful for considering the role of common sense in philosophy. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month, and you will gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which occurs on the second Sunday of every month at 2 p.m. Central, I think. Check my channel description just to confirm that. You can come with a philosophy problem, with some reading that you need help on, whatever it may be, it's up to you. I also have super thanks available if you just want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap and I'd appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.